The morning Kate Donnelly pressed her palm flat against the weathered doorframe of her farmhouse and stared down a man in a pressed suit holding papers she had never asked for. Something in the Kansas Territory air shifted, like the moment before a thunderstorm when every blade of grass goes perfectly still. It was the spring of 1878, and the land along the Cimarron River had been green and breathing with new life for exactly the 3 years Kate had worked it. 3 years of broken nails and sunburned shoulders and nights, when she had cried so hard into her pillow that she woke up with swollen eyes and still found a way to rise before dawn and do it all again. 3 years since her husband, Thomas Donnelly, had ridden out to bring back the doctor for their neighbor's sick child and had not come back at all, taken by a fever himself before he ever reached the next town. 3 years of proving to every man in Caldwell, Kansas, that a woman alone on 30 acres was not a woman waiting to be rescued, but a woman building something that would outlast the lot of them. So when the land agent's buggy rolled up the dirt path that cut through her east field, she wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the porch with her chin already raised. The land agent's name was Gerald Forsyth, and he had the kind of face that had never known real weather. His cheeks were pale and soft beneath a trim mustache, and his suit was the color of dried tobacco, and he stepped down from that buggy like he was delivering good news to someone who had been waiting for it. "Mrs. Donnelly," he said, tipping his hat just enough to be called polite. "Gerald Forsyth, representing the Southwestern Kansas Land and Railroad Development Company. I trust you've had time to review the notice we sent." Kate had received the notice 11 days ago. She had read it 4 times. Then she had folded it, placed it inside the tin box where she kept her marriage certificate and the deed to this land, and gone out to pull up the winter weeds from her kitchen garden, as though the paper had no power over her at all. "I received it," she said. Forsyth pulled a leather satchel from behind the buggy seat and set it on the porch step without being invited. "Then you understand that the Railroad Survey has placed the proposed Cimarron spur line directly through this section of the territory. The company has been more than generous in its offer. The assessed value of the land plus 30% on top. You'd walk away with enough to start fresh somewhere else." "I don't want to start fresh somewhere else," Kate said. "I started fresh here. I'm finished starting." Forsyth smiled the smile of a man who had heard this particular answer before and had already prepared his next 3 sentences in response. "Mrs. Donnelly, I understand this property holds sentimental value. Truly I do. But sentiment doesn't hold up in a territorial court, and the company has already filed the acquisition paperwork in Wichita. You have 30 days to accept the buyout before the matter proceeds to legal action." Kate felt the heat rise in her chest, the kind that was not anger alone but the very specific combination of anger and grief and exhaustion that had kept her upright through every hard thing she had ever faced. "This is my land," she said, and her voice was quiet and clear the way a bell is quiet and clear, carrying further than you expect. "My name is on the deed. My husband and I filed it properly through the Territorial Land Office in 1875. I broke this ground. I planted every furrow in that east field. I dug the well. I built the fence line with my own 2 hands after a storm took the first one down. I will not be moved." Forsyth's smile tightened at the corners. "The company's attorneys have reviewed the deed situation. There are certain provisions under the Territorial Land Acquisition Act that—" "I know what's in the territorial codes," Kate said. "I've had 3 years of nothing but time to learn exactly what I'm owed and what I'm not. And what I know is that no railroad company bought this land, and no railroad company is going to put me off it." She told him again, clearly, the way you tell a dog to stay. "I will not be moved." Forsyth straightened and picked up his satchel, and for a moment he looked less like a messenger and more like a man calculating something. "I'll return in a week, Mrs. Donnelly. I do hope you'll have reconsidered by then." He climbed back into his buggy and turned it around, and Kate watched him go until the dust from his wheels had settled back onto the road. Then she sat down on the porch step where his satchel had been, and she pressed her forehead against her knees and she breathed. She did not cry. She had made herself a quiet rule about crying in the daylight. The next morning she rode into Caldwell on her brown mare, Nell, to speak with the only lawyer in town she trusted, a retired judge named Arthur Price who kept an office above the dry goods store and who had helped her settle Thomas's affairs without charging her anything. He did not absolutely have to. She tied Nell to the post outside and climbed the stairs and knocked on the frosted glass of his door. Price was a small man with white hair and wire spectacles who looked at problems the way other men looked at chessboards. He listened to Kate without interrupting, which she appreciated deeply. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The Southwestern Kansas Land and Railroad Development Company has been filing acquisitions all across this section of the territory for 8 months, he said. They are not wrong that there are provisions in the territorial codes that allow for eminent domain-style acquisition when a development is deemed to serve the public interest. They're also not wrong that your deed has a small problem. Kate felt her stomach drop. What problem? Price opened a drawer and pulled out a yellowed map. When your husband filed the original deed, the survey description along the eastern boundary was recorded with an error. The creek marker they used as a reference point was mislabeled. It creates a legal ambiguity about whether the easternmost 8 acres of your property are actually legally yours under the filed deed, or whether they revert to unclaimed territorial land. Those 8 acres are my east field, Kate said. That's my best growing land. I know, Price said. And the railroad survey happens to run directly through those 8 acres. Kate stared at the map. She thought of the east field in the morning, the way the light came across it low and golden and the clover smell rose up from the damp soil, and something in her chest tightened so hard it was almost physical. What do I do? You'd need to file a corrected survey and have the deed amended through the Territorial Land Office in Wichita. That process takes time, and it requires a licensed surveyor's report confirming the correct boundary. If you can get that done inside 30 days, you have a solid legal argument. If you can't, Price took his spectacles off and cleaned them, which Kate had learned was what he did when he was about to say something he did not want to say. Then the company's attorneys have more ground to stand on than I'd like. Kate rode home with the map rolled inside her saddlebag and her mind working through everything that needed to happen in 30 days. She needed a surveyor. She needed money for the surveyor. She needed to get to Wichita. She needed all of that to happen faster than a land company with a team of lawyers and 30 years of experience pushing people off their land. She was so deep in thought when she turned Nell down the lane toward her barn that she almost did not notice the horse tied to her fence post. It was a large animal, a bay with a black mane, and a working man's saddle worn smooth with real use, not the kind of horse that belonged to a lawyer or a land agent. There was a bedroll tied behind the cantle and a rifle scabbard against the fender, and the whole setup had the look of someone who moved a lot and had learned to bring everything necessary with them. Kate pulled Nell up and looked at the animal for a long moment before she looked toward her porch, where a man was sitting on the top step with his hat in his hands, and his head turned to look at her with a patient expression that did not seem to assume anything about whether it was welcome. He was tall even sitting down. She could tell that much. He had dark hair that was a little too long at the collar and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days, and his eyes were a particular shade of brown that she would have called warm if she had been in any kind of mood to call anything warm, which she was not. His clothes were working clothes, faded and road-dusted but clean in the way that said he cared enough to take care of himself. And his boots were good boots, and his hands, she noticed because she always noticed hands, were big and calloused and scarred in the way of a man who had been working with them since boyhood. "Mrs. Donnelly," he said, standing up and settling his hat back on his head in a single easy motion. "That's right," Kate said. She did not get off Nell. "My name is Vernon Underwood. I work for a cattle outfit out of Dodge City. We were running a herd through this section last week, and I passed your property, and I saw you talking to a fellow from Forsyth's company." He paused, and something in his expression was careful and honest at the same time. "I stopped because I've seen that company's work before. They came through a section of the Flint Hills 2 years ago and pushed 3 families off land they'd held for 10 years. I thought you might want to know what you're dealing with." Kate looked at him for a long moment. In 3 years of living alone, she had learned to read men quickly, the ones who were helpful and the ones who wore helpfulness as a way to get inside a door they had not been invited through. This man's face was steady and open in a way that was different from both of those things. He looked, she thought, like someone who simply said what he meant. "You came back," she said. "I did," he said. "You rode back after the herd was through." "Yes, ma'am." She considered that. "All right," she said, and got down from Nell. "Come inside and tell me what you know." She made coffee on the cast iron stove, and he sat at her kitchen table with his hat on his knee, and told her everything he had learned in the Flint Hills, about the southwestern Kansas Land and Railroad Development Company's methods, about the specific attorneys they used, about the way they targeted deed ambiguities with the precision of men who had done this many times before and knew exactly which threads to pull. He was clear and specific and did not editorialize, and Kate found herself leaning forward over her coffee cup without realizing it. "You know a great deal about this company for a cattle drover," she said when he had finished. Vernon turned his hat brim slowly in his hands. "One of those families in the Flint Hills was my father's cousin, a woman named Vernon Underwood. She'd been farming 60 acres on her own for 8 years after her husband died. She fought them for 4 months. In the end, she lost the property because she couldn't get the legal work done fast enough." He looked at the table. "I wasn't there when it happened. I was on a cattle drive north to Abilene. By the time I got back, it was finished. I've thought about that a good many times since." Kate was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I need a surveyor who can file a corrected survey in Wichita inside 30 days. Vernon looked up at her. "I know a man in Dodge City, a fellow named Moses Greer, a freedman who's been working as a licensed surveyor for 6 years. He's good and he's fast and he's honest, and the Territorial Land Office in Wichita has accepted his filings before without argument." "Does he charge a fair price?" "He charges what the work is worth. I could ride to Dodge City and bring him back here inside 4 days. Kate set her coffee cup down on the table with a quiet firmness that was almost like punctuation. "Why would you do that, Mr. Underwood? You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Vernon met her eyes directly. He did not look away, and he did not look at the floor, and he did not give her a charming smile. He said, "Because it's right. And because I didn't help Ellen, and I've been carrying that ever since, and this time I'm here and it seems like I can do something." There was a long, honest silence in the kitchen, and Kate felt something shift inside her that she could not quite name yet, something that had nothing to do with land deeds or railroad companies. She filed it away in the same careful place she filed everything she was not ready to examine yet. "For days," she said. "All right, I'll pay you for your time when this is settled." "No need," Vernon said. "There is need," Kate said firmly. "I do not accept favors I cannot account for." He almost smiled at that. It was not quite a smile, but something close to it, something in the corner of his mouth that recognized that she meant it. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and stood up and settled his hat on his head. He was gone before dark, riding north toward Dodge City, and Kate stood on the porch and watched the bay horse disappear around the bend of her road, and then stood there a moment longer than was necessary before she went back inside. She spent the next 4 days doing what she always did when she was frightened, which was work. She repaired the gap in the north fence. She turned the soil in the kitchen garden. She cleaned the barn so thoroughly that her old rooster, who liked to sleep in the hay corner, looked at her with an expression of profound, offended dignity. She wrote a careful letter to Arthur Price explaining what she had learned from Vernon and asking him to begin drafting the corrected deed amendment in anticipation of the survey. She did not sleep well on any of those nights, but she slept, which was something. On the evening of the fourth day, she heard horses on the road and went to the porch and saw Vernon coming back with a man riding beside him, a broad-shouldered black man of perhaps 40 with a calm, measuring face and a leather case across his back that held his surveying instruments. "Mrs. Donnelly," Vernon said, swinging down from his horse. "This is Moses Greer." Moses Greer took off his hat and held it correctly, and his handshake when Kate extended her hand was firm and equal. "Mr. Underwood tells me you're fighting the railroad company," he said. "Good. I've surveyed better land than this that they've taken. Let's make sure they don't take yours." Kate liked him immediately and completely. They worked the next day from dawn to mid-afternoon, Moses moving across her east field with his instruments, and his notebook with the focused precision of a man who loved his craft. Vernon helped carry equipment and move the stakes, and Kate walked with them because she needed to understand every measurement and every notation, because she needed to be able to speak to this survey in any legal proceeding that followed. As the afternoon light began to slant long and golden across the field, Vernon came to stand beside her while Moses made his final notations. They stood in the tall grass at the eastern edge of the property, looking across the river bend to where the land curved away toward the low hills, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, which surprised Kate, because very little had been comfortable for her in a very long time. "It's good land," Vernon said. "It's the best land I've ever seen," Kate said. "I know I'm partial, but I believe it honestly." He was quiet for a moment. "Where are you from originally?" "Ohio," she said. "Columbus. My father was a school teacher. When Thomas and I came west, half my family thought we had lost our minds." "Did you think you'd lost your minds?" Kate looked out over her east field, over the green of it in the afternoon light, over the way the river glittered at the far edge. "No," she said. "I thought we'd found our minds, actually, for the first time." He nodded like that made sense to him. "I'm from Missouri," he said. "My father ran a small farm. I started droving cattle at 16 because we needed the money, and then I kept doing it because." He paused. "Well, I suppose because I was good at it, and because it suited me, and because I hadn't yet found something I wanted more." Kate looked at him sideways. He was looking at the field, not at her, and there was something in his profile, in the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his gaze, that she found unexpectedly difficult to look away from. She looked away anyway. "How old are you, Mr. Underwood?" she asked, because she was a woman who believed in knowing the plain facts of things. 28, he said. "I'm 26, she said, "in case you were wondering." He looked at her then with that almost smile again. "I was wondering," he admitted. Moses Greer came across the field to them with his notebook open and his face satisfied. "Your eastern boundary is exactly where I thought it was," he said. "The original deed's creek marker was a cartographic error, not a legal one. The creek they referenced is the correct creek. It was simply mislabeled on the territorial map used by the original surveyor. Your claim to the full 30 acres is sound. I can have the corrected survey report drafted and notarized in Dodge City within a week, and you can file it in Wichita within 10 days. That gives you 3 weeks to spare." Kate let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 11 days. She pressed her hand briefly against her eyes and then straightened and said, "Thank you, Mr. Greer. What do I owe you?" $14 for the survey and the filing report," Moses said. "That's my standard fee." It was not nothing, $14, but it was within what she had in the tin box beneath her bed, the careful savings of 3 years of selling eggs and vegetables and the occasional pieced quilt at the market in Caldwell. "I'll pay you now," Kate said, and walked back to the farmhouse with both men following, and she counted out the money from the tin box at the kitchen table with the quiet exactness of someone for whom $14 meant something real. Moses Greer rode out that evening, heading back to Dodge City to prepare the survey report. Vernon lingered by his horse, checking the saddle cinch with unnecessary thoroughness, and Kate stood on the porch watching him. "You should stay the night," she said. "It's getting dark and the road through the creek crossing is bad in the spring mud. There's a bunk in the barn. It's clean." He looked up at her. I don't want to impose on you, Mrs. Donnelly. I offered, she said. I don't offer things I don't mean. He nodded and led his horse into the barn, and Kate made a simple supper of salt pork and beans and cornbread, and she called him in when it was ready, and they ate at the kitchen table in the lamplight with the spring peepers beginning their chorus outside the open window, and Kate thought how strange and quietly wonderful it was to have a voice in this kitchen that was not her own. They talked for a long time. About Ohio and Missouri, about cattle drives north through the Indian Territory, about the way the Kansas sky looked different from any other sky Vernon had ever been under, which he had never said to anyone before, and seemed slightly surprised to find himself saying now. Kate told him about teaching herself to slaughter a hog the first winter after Thomas died, because it had to be done, and there was no one to do it, and about the particular satisfaction of watching the first crop come up in the east field in the spring of 1876, the way the green shoots had appeared in rows, as though the land itself was fulfilling a promise she had made to it. Vernon listened to her the way very few people in her life had ever listened, with his full attention and without the waiting to speak quality that most people's listening had. He asked questions that were good questions, the kind that said he had been paying attention to everything she said before. "You're not going to lose this land," he said, when the lamp had burned down and the night had grown properly late. "No," Kate said, "I'm not." He looked at her across the table. "I didn't mean it as comfort," he said. "I meant it as fact. You're the most determined person I've ever sat across a table from, and I've worked cattle with some very determined men." Kate felt color come into her face, which irritated her slightly because she was not someone who blushed at compliments. She stood up and began clearing the dishes. "Get some sleep, Mr. Underwood. The bunk has a good blanket." She heard him laugh quietly as he went out through the door, and she stood at the dry sink with her hands in the wash water and let herself smile at the dark window for a moment before she put it away and went to bed. The survey report from Moses Greer arrived in Dodge City on schedule, and Vernon rode back to Kate's farm with it sealed and notarized on a cool, clear morning at the end of the second week. She met him on the porch with her good coat already on, and her hair pinned up more carefully than usual, which she had told herself was simply because she was going to a territorial government office and ought to look respectable. They made the ride to Wichita together over 2 days, camping at the river crossing the first night where there was good water and a stand of cottonwoods that made a natural windbreak. Kate had packed food for the road, dried biscuits and salted meat, and a small jar of the apple preserves she had put up last fall, and Vernon had a coffee pot and a good fire going before the sky had fully darkened. She had lived 3 years of solitude and had believed herself perfectly contented within it. She had made herself believe that because the alternative, which was admitting she was lonely, felt too much like weakness. But sitting beside that fire with the coffee steam rising between her and this man who was quiet and capable, and somehow managed to take up exactly as much space as he was supposed to and no more, she understood that she had been telling herself a story about herself that was not completely true. "Tell me about the cattle drives," she said. He told her. He told her about the Kishom Trail and the long push north from Texas through Indian Territory, about crossing the Red River when it was running high, about the summer 3 years ago when a lightning storm had scattered a herd of 1,200 longhorns across 6 miles of open country, and every drover had ridden through the night to bring them back. He told it without embellishment, the way men who have actually done hard things tend to tell them, and Kate listened and watched the fire and thought that she had been right about his hands. They were storytelling hands too, she noticed, the way they moved slightly when he was describing something, unconsciously tracing the shapes of the things he was talking about. "Do you want to keep droving?" she asked. "Is that the life you see for yourself?" He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "I'm not sure anymore," he said. "I used to think I'd be happy moving as long as I could move. But I'm 28 years old and I've been doing this since I was 16, and somewhere in the last year or two I've started looking at land differently." He paused, looking at it like something I want to stop on instead of something to cross. Kate looked at the fire. The cottonwood leaves above them moved in the night breeze with a soft rattling sound that was one of the best sounds in the world. She had always thought, "This territory is still full of good land," she said. "Some of it not yet claimed." "I've noticed," Vernon said, and did not say anything more, and the quiet between them was the kind that held more than either of them was ready to put into words yet. They reached Wichita on the second afternoon, riding into the territorial capital through streets that were busier and louder than Caldwell, full of horses and wagons and the noise of commerce. Kate had been here once before with Thomas, when they had filed the original deed, and she knew where the land office was. They tied the horses outside the Territorial Land Office, a brick building on the main street that had the self-important air of government architecture everywhere. Kate carried Moses Greer's survey report in the leather case she had borrowed from Price, and Vernon walked beside her with his hat in his hand, and she noticed that several people on the street looked at them as though they were together in the way men and women are together, and she found that she did not mind it. The clerk at the land office was a young man with ink stains on his fingers, who listened to Kate's explanation of the deed amendment with the polite skepticism of someone who had heard many explanations from many people, and had learned not to trust any of them on sight. He took Moses Greer's survey report and examined it, and then took it to a senior clerk in the back room. Kate and Vernon waited at the counter, and Kate stood straight and kept her expression patient and her hands still, which was something she had practiced. The senior clerk came out. He was an older man with reading spectacles on a string around his neck and the careful eyes of someone who had spent decades reading documents for a living. He looked at the survey report, then at Kate's original deed, then at the survey report again. "The survey methodology is correct," he said, "and the mislabeling of the creek marker on the territorial map is documented here. This is a map error, not a deed error." He looked at Kate. "You'll need to file a formal petition for deed amendment accompanied by this survey report. The fee is $2, and the amendment will be recorded within 60 days. 30 days, Kate said. "I have a company filing an acquisition claim against this property based on the ambiguity created by the map error. I need the amendment recorded before my 30 days is up." The senior clerk looked at her over his spectacles. "Mrs. Donnelly, the standard processing time. The standard processing time exists because people don't know their deadlines," Kate said. "I know mine. I'm asking you to look at this case, which is legally straightforward, and tell me honestly whether there is any technical reason the amendment cannot be expedited." There was a pause. The senior clerk looked at her with the expression of a man who was deciding something. Then he said, "There is a priority filing status available for cases where a legal claim is pending against the property in question. The fee is $5, and the amendment is recorded within 14 days. "I'll take that," Kate said. She paid the $5 at the counter and received the receipt and the filing confirmation, and when she walked out of the land office into the Wichita afternoon sunshine, she stood on the steps for a moment and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for 2 solid weeks. Vernon came to stand beside her. He looked at her with that direct, warm look that she was beginning to recognize as specifically his. 14 days, she said. "That's well within your window," he said. "Yes," she said. And then, because the relief was real and he had made a great deal of this possible by riding to Dodge City and bringing Moses Greer, she turned and looked at him directly and said, "Thank you, Vernon, I mean that." He looked slightly startled by it, not by the thanks but by something else, some quality in the way she said it, and for just a moment his carefully steady expression opened up into something softer and more unguarded. He said, "You did the hard part." "We both know that isn't entirely true," Kate said. They stayed in Wichita that night, Kate at the women's boarding house on the main street and Vernon at the hotel across from it. and in the morning they had breakfast at the lunch counter of the dry goods store before riding out together toward the south and the long road home. And Kate thought about the word home, and about the fact that she had just thought of it that way, the long road home, as though home were something that included the company of the person beside her, rather than just the specific patch of Kansas ground she was returning to. She did not say any of this out loud, but she rode a little closer to him than she strictly needed to on the wide road south, and neither of them mentioned it. 4 days after they returned to Kate's farm, Gerald Forsythe came back. He arrived in his dust-colored suit on a Tuesday morning while Kate was mending the chicken coop with a hammer and a fresh board. She heard his buggy and straightened up and pushed the hair back from her forehead with the back of her wrist and waited for him. This time, he did not come alone. There was another man in the buggy with him, a broader man in a different kind of suit who had the blunt, flat look of someone employed to make things final. An enforcer in a businessman's coat, Kate thought. She saw, at the same moment, that Vernon was in the yard too. He had been there since the morning, having come back the day before to finish some fence repairs she had mentioned needing done, and he had done them without being asked twice, and without the peculiar wounded pride that some men attach to being directed by a woman. He was leaning against the corner of the barn now, his arms crossed, watching the buggy come up the lane with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely attentive. Forsythe climbed down from the buggy and came toward the farmhouse, and he opened his mouth to begin his prepared speech. Kate spoke first. "Mr. Forsythe, I filed a corrected survey report and a priority deed amendment in Wichita 6 days ago. The amendment will be recorded within 14 days, well inside your company's claim window, at which point the deed ambiguity on which your acquisition is based will no longer exist. I suggest you take that back to your company's attorneys." Forsythe's mouth closed. He looked at her with a narrowed calculation that was different from his previous visits, less certain. The company's legal team will need to review any amendment before he began. "They can review whatever they like," Kate said. "The filing is done, and the fee is paid, and the senior clerk's confirmation is right here." She held up the receipt and the filing confirmation she had been keeping in her apron pocket because she had known he would come back. "I have a legal claim in process. Your company has no acquisition ground while that claim is pending. I'd ask you to speak with your attorneys before you say anything else to me, Mr. Forsythe." There was a long pause. The larger man in the buggy said nothing but looked at Vernon, who had not moved from the corner of the barn and who continued to not move, a fact that seemed to register on the larger man with some specificity. Forsythe looked at the filing confirmation. He looked at Kate. He looked at Vernon. "Nobody is moving her," Vernon said very quietly from the corner of the barn. He said it the way you state a natural law, the way you say the sun rises in the east, with no heat and no threat but an absolute certainty that made it more effective than any raised voice could have been. Forsythe pressed his lips together. He put his hat back on his head with the precise care of a man managing his composure. He said, "The company will be in contact through the appropriate legal channels." "I look forward to hearing from them," Kate said. Forsythe drove away, and the man in the broad suit drove away with him, and when the buggy had rounded the bend, Kate let out a long, slow breath and found that her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them together to stop it. Vernon came across the yard and stood a few feet from her. "You were magnificent," he said. "I was terrified," she said. "I know," he said. "That's what makes it magnificent." Kate looked at him and felt something move through her chest like warm water, and she thought, quite clearly and for the first time, that she was in a great deal of trouble. She asked him to stay for supper. He did. And then there was a problem with the water pump that he offered to look at, and then it was too late to ride back to the Dodge City road safely, and so he stayed in the barn bunk again. And the next morning she made coffee and eggs, and he sat at her kitchen table in the early light looking as though he belonged there in a way that both comforted and alarmed her. "You don't have a herd to get back to?" she asked. "The drive ended 3 weeks ago," he said. I don't start the next one until July." "So you have time," she said. "I have time," he agreed. He stayed for the rest of the week. He repaired 3 sections of the south fence and rehung the barn door that had been stiff all winter, and helped her move the heavy seed bags that she had been managing alone by dragging across the floor. He was not an intrusive presence. He did not offer opinions about how she ran her farm unless she asked for them, and when she asked, he gave them directly, and without the falsely modest preamble that some men used to disguise the fact that they thought they knew better. He did not know better about her farm, and he seemed to understand that. In the evenings they sat on the porch and talked while the light faded over the Kansas hills. She told him about Thomas, carefully and with appropriate emotion, the way you tell someone about a person you loved who is no longer there. And he listened with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, not rushing her past the painful parts and not lingering in them either. He told her about the woman he had been courting in Dodge City 2 years ago, a young woman named Clara who had decided that a cattle drover's life was not what she wanted and had married a shopkeeper instead, and he spoke about it without bitterness, with the thoughtful retrospection of someone who had learned something true from the experience. "Were you heartbroken?" Kate asked. "I thought I was," Vernon said. "Looking back, I think I was more startled than heartbroken, which probably tells you something about how deep it went." Kate nodded. She looked out at the evening sky, at the way the pink light was fading into lavender over the hills. "I think real heartbreak is when you keep reaching for the person even after you know they're gone," she said. "The involuntary reaching, like your hand going to a place on the table where a coffee cup used to be." Vernon was quiet for a moment. "That's exactly what it is," he said. He looked at her with an expression she had been noticing more and more over the past week, a steady, warm attention that had depth to it. That was not the look of a man being polite, but the look of a man who was paying attention, because he genuinely wanted to know everything he was seeing. "You've been through a great deal," he said. "I've been through exactly as much as the situation required," Kate said, with the slight tartness she used when she felt something was getting close to something she was not ready for. He smiled. Not the almost smile this time, but a real one, and it changed his whole face, took the steadiness in it and added warmth. And Kate's chest did the thing it had been doing with increasing regularity around him, the warm water thing, the unguarded thing. She stood up rather suddenly and said she needed to check on Nell's water bucket, and went to do that, and stood in the barn in the dark for a full minute pressing her forehead against Nell's warm neck, and saying, silently and with some exasperation, "What is happening to you, Kate Donnelly?" Nell had no opinion on the matter. When she came back to the porch, Vernon was looking at the stars, which were extraordinary in the Kansas sky without any city light to dim them, and he looked over at her when she sat back down with an expression of such uncomplicated pleasure at the fact of her being there that it nearly undid her. "I should tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "I didn't just come back because of the railroad company," he said. "I mean, that was real. What I know about Forsyth's company is real, and I would have come back for that reason alone. But I also—" He stopped and turned his hat brim in his hands, which she had noticed was something he did when he was choosing words carefully. "I came around the bend in the road and I saw your property, and I saw you standing on that porch talking to Forsyth, and there was something in the way you were standing, something in how you were holding yourself, that made me pull my horse up and watch for a minute, like I recognized something I hadn't seen before." Kate looked at the stars. Her heart was doing something very inconvenient. "What did you recognize?" she said, carefully. "I don't know exactly," he said. "Except that it made me not want to ride past." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I have to be honest with you, Mr. Underwood, because I am someone who is always honest with people who deserve honesty." She paused. "I am extremely glad you did not ride past, and that frightens me considerably." Vernon was very still. Then he said, "Why does it frighten you?" "Because I built this life to be solid and sufficient and not dependent on anyone else's decisions," Kate said. "And what frightens me is not the feeling itself. What frightens me is how quickly and thoroughly it arrived." He looked at her, and there was something in his eyes that was careful and honest and very warm. "I think," he said slowly, "that might be a good thing rather than a bad one. If something arrives quickly and thoroughly, it might mean it was always supposed to." Kate looked at him. She thought about Thomas, whom she had loved with the comfortable, patient love of two people who had known each other since they were young. And she thought about this, about whatever this was, which was not the same thing at all. It was sharper and more immediate and more frightening, and it was also, underneath the fright, something that felt like recognizing a place you had not been before but somehow knew. "Go to bed, Vernon," she said quietly. He stood up. He picked up his hat. He looked at her one more time with that open, warm expression that she was going to have to do something about eventually. "Good night, Kate," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. "Good night," she said, and did not add the Mr., and they both knew what that meant. The deed amendment came back from Wichita on a Thursday, 17 days after she had filed it, confirmed and recorded and stamped with the official seal of the Territorial Land Office. Kate held it in both hands at the kitchen table and read it 3 times, and then she went to the east field and stood in the middle of it in the afternoon sun with her feet in the good dark soil, and said out loud to the empty field, "You're mine, properly, for the record." The grass did not answer, but the wind moved through it in a way that felt like agreement. She wrote to Arthur Price informing him of the confirmed amendment and asking him to send formal notice to Forsyth's company through the appropriate legal channels. Price wrote back 2 days later with his characteristically understated satisfaction. "The company's attorneys have received the notice and have withdrawn the acquisition claim for the eastern 8 acres. In my experience, companies like this one move on to easier targets when their legal footing disappears. I believe you are clear, Mrs. Donnelly." "Well done." Vernon was there when the letter arrived, sitting on the porch doing the very useful business of mending a broken rein with a needle and heavy thread that he carried in his saddlebag. And Kate came out with the letter and read him the relevant passage and watched his face do something that was simple and real and good, the face of someone who is genuinely happy about someone else's happiness. "It's done," Kate said. "It's done," he agreed. She sat down on the step beside him. Not across from him, not at a careful social distance, but right beside him, close enough that she could have put her hand on his arm without reaching, and she thought that being close to him had come to feel as natural as being in her own kitchen. "What will you do in July?" she asked, "when the cattle drive starts?" He was quiet for a moment. He set the mended rein across his knee. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "Have you?" "I've been thinking about a lot of things," he said. He looked at her, and the directness of it, the way he did not manage or moderate it, always made her feel seen in a way that was not comfortable and not uncomfortable but simply true. "The land you mentioned, that's still unclaimed along the creek north of your property." Kate's heart gave a particular careful beat. "It is," she said, 160 acres if you follow the Homestead Act provisions." "That's right," she said. "I've been doing the arithmetic," he said, "on what it would take to file a claim and make something of it." Kate looked at him. She felt something gathering in her chest, something that was the sum of everything of the past weeks, of the fire and the cottonwood trees and the kitchen table and the morning light and the way he listened, and the way he had stood at the corner of the barn, and said nobody is moving her with that quiet certainty that had cut straight through Forsyth's bluster like a plow blade through good soil. "Vernon," she said. "Yes," he said. "If you are considering filing that land claim for reasons that have anything to do with this farm and the person who lives on it, I would like you to say that plainly. Because I am a plain-spoken woman and I prefer it when people say what they mean." He turned on the step so he was facing her, and the expression on his face was one she would remember for the rest of her life, open and certain and warm, and a little bit brave the way that honesty always requires a little bit of bravery. "I want to file that land claim because I want to stop moving," he said. "And I want to stop moving here near you, because somewhere in the past 3 weeks I have come to believe, as clearly as I have ever believed anything, that you are the most remarkable person I have ever known, and the idea of riding away from this farm in July and not coming back is genuinely intolerable to me. And I am saying that plainly, Mrs. Donnelly, because you asked me to." Kate looked at him for a long, still moment. The spring wind moved through the grass in the east field. Nell moved in the barn with the soft sound of an animal settling into contentment. "Kate," she said. He looked at her. "You called me Kate last week," she said. "You may continue doing that." He smiled. The full, real smile. "Kate," he said, and the way he said it, with the warmth of everything that had accumulated between them in these weeks, made her name sound like a different, better version of itself. "I think," she said carefully, "that a man who wanted to file a land claim north of my property would be a very welcome neighbor. Only a neighbor." He said, and there was the almost smile along with the real smile now. "Start with neighbor," she said, "and we'll see what honesty requires after that." He reached out and took her hand, which was still calloused from the work she never stopped doing, and held it in his, which was calloused from 15 years of ropes and horses, and they sat on the porch together in the warm Kansas afternoon and looked at the east field that was hers, properly and for the record, and Kate thought that she had not expected this, had not planned for it, had told herself she did not need it, and was now entirely grateful to have been wrong. Over the next several weeks, Vernon rode out to look at the land north of Kate's property, and found it to be exactly what she had described. Good Kansas ground with creek access and enough elevation to escape the worst of the spring flooding, with a natural windbreak of trees along the northern edge, and soil dark enough to make a farmer's heart lift. He filed the Homestead Act claim through the Territorial Land Office in Caldwell, paying the $14 filing fee from his savings, and received his provisional certificate 2 weeks later. He set up a camp on the claim land while he began the process of establishing the residency requirements, sleeping in a tent those first weeks while he broke ground and built the frame of what would eventually become a house. Kate rode out to see the progress every few days, and when she did they would walk the land together, marking where the house would stand and where the barn should go, and she gave opinions freely when he asked for them, which he always did, and he listened to them the way he listened to everything she said, which was with his whole attention. Moses Greer came down from Dodge City in late June to do the survey on Vernon's land claim, and Kate made a proper dinner and they all three sat at her kitchen table and ate it. And there was something in that evening, in the ease of it and the laughter and the quality of the company, that felt like the beginning of a life rather than an episode within one. Moses Greer, before he rode out the next morning, looked at Kate and then at Vernon and then back at Kate with the quiet, knowing expression of a man who did not miss much. "You've got good land and good people," he said, to both of them equally. "That's more than most." After he rode away, Kate said, without looking at Vernon, "He was speaking to both of us." "I noticed that," Vernon said. She looked at him then. The morning light was full on his face, and she thought that she would like to look at that face in the morning light for a very long time. "Vernon," she said. "Yes, Kate." "I love you," she said, directly, and with all the plain-spoken certainty she had always applied to everything that mattered. "I have been aware of it for some time, and I see no benefit in continuing to not say it." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that moved through surprise and relief and recognition, and arrived at something that was simple and certain and good. "I love you," he said. "I think I knew it the night we camped at the Cottonwood Crossing, and you told me about the east field in the spring." Kate walked the 2 steps between them and took his face in her hands, her calloused farmwoman's hands, and looked at him at close range for a long, honest moment. And then she kissed him, and he kissed her back with the same quality of full attention he brought to everything, and the Kansas summer morning went about its business around them. He proposed to her on a Sunday afternoon in July, on the east field, in the middle of the clover, with no ceremony and no ring because he had not yet been to a jeweler, just with the direct and earnest honesty of a man who knew what he wanted, and had decided that the time for speaking plainly was always now. He said he wanted to spend his life beside her on this land and on the land to the north, and that he believed they were better people beside each other than they were apart, and that he had never been so certain of anything in the specific way he was certain of this. Kate said yes before he had fully finished the last sentence, which he found, and she found equally funny, and they laughed together in the east field in the summer sunshine, and Nell watched them from the fence with the magnificent indifference of a horse who had seen everything. They married in September in the Caldwell church, with Arthur Price walking Kate down the aisle because she had no father present, and she trusted Price as well as she would have trusted a blood relation. Moses Greer rode down from Dodge City for the ceremony and sat in the front row, and the three women Kate had made friends with over 3 years of Sunday services and market days filled out the rest of the church. Vernon had 2 of his fellow drovers from the Dodge City outfit, men named Hector Blas and William James, who cleaned up considerably for the occasion and sat in the back row looking both proud and slightly dazed, the way men at weddings often do. The minister was a young man who had come out from Illinois only the year before and still seemed slightly startled by the openness of the Kansas sky, and he read the ceremony with genuine feeling and a good speaking voice. And when he said, "You may now kiss your bride," there was a quality of warmth in that church that Kate had not expected, the accumulated warmth of people who were genuinely glad for 2 people who deserved to be glad. Vernon kissed her in front of all of them with the same directness he brought to everything, and Kate laughed, quietly, against his mouth, and the people in the church applauded. After the ceremony they held a dinner at Kate's farm, which was now their farm, and Arthur Price gave a toast that was precise and kind, and contained one excellent joke that nobody but Kate fully understood, and Moses Greer told a story about the survey of the East Field that made everyone laugh, and Hector Blas played a guitar that he had brought strapped to his saddle, and played it so well that several people danced on the porch boards, and the September evening was warm and full of stars. Vernon's house north of Kate's land was finished to a livable standard by December, though it stood largely unused because they had decided early that the practical and sensible thing was for him to move into the farmhouse, which was the larger and more established property, and to use the north land for expanding the cattle operation that Vernon had begun to plan. The north land would eventually run a small herd, not the massive drives of his droving days, but something manageable and entirely their own, and Kate's east field would supply the feed and market crops, and together the 2 pieces of land would be something larger and more secure than either had been alone. They spent that first winter learning the specific daily grammar of sharing a life in a small farmhouse on the Kansas plains, the negotiations over wood supply and cooking duties, and the proper way to store boots, and whether the lamp oil was adequately replenished, the larger conversations about money and the next season's planting, and where Vernon wanted to put the first cattle fence. There were disagreements, because they were both strong-willed and both opinionated, and both had the conviction that they were usually right, which in both cases was often but not always true. They were not easy disagreements to get through, but they got through them, because they had both learned in different ways and different times that getting through things was what you did. And in the getting through things and the learning of each other's grammar, something deepened that had been deep from the beginning. Something settled and grew and became the kind of love that is not just the initial recognition, but all the subsequent choosing, all the daily acts of turning toward a person instead of away from them, of treating their thoughts as worth hearing and their worries as worth taking seriously and their joy as something worth protecting. In the spring of 1879, Kate found that she was expecting a child. She told Vernon on the porch on a March evening when the first green was just beginning in the east field, told him the same way she told him everything, directly and without excessive preamble. He went very still in the way he went still when something was important to him, And then he looked at her with an expression that she filed away in the best part of her memory. The place where she kept the things she wanted to be able to look at whenever she needed to remember that life was genuinely, specifically good. He put his arms around her and held her in the March evening with the east field greening behind them, and she felt his heart beating at a different pace than usual, faster and more present. And she held on to him and thought about Thomas, and about the years of solitude, and about the land agent's buggy coming up the drive, and about how none of it, not any single piece of it, had been wasted. The summer of 1879 was a good one, warm and adequately rained, and full of the specific pleasures of a productive season. The east field yielded better than any year before it. The combination of Vernon's additional labor in the turning and Kate's careful attention to the soil, and the weather producing a harvest that made Arthur Price, when Kate told him the numbers, say that she had made the best piece of ground in the Cimarron section. Vernon's Northland received its first small cattle herd in June, 12 head of good stock that he purchased from a drover he trusted, and the fence lines he had built through the winter held solid, and the animals settled into the land as though they had always been there. Moses Greer came down from Dodge City in August, as he had begun to do twice a year, because the friendship that had started with a survey in the East Field had become a real one, the kind built on genuine regard and mutual respect. He and Vernon spent an afternoon looking over the Northland fence lines and the cattle operation, and talking with the serious pleasure of two men who both understood the technical aspects of what they were looking at. Kate made a dinner that was better than usual because she had the time and the good food available, and they sat long at the table after it and talked about everything from the progress of statehood discussions for the territory to the best variety of winter wheat for this specific section of Kansas. And when Moses rode out the next morning, he shook both their hands and said he would be back in November. In November, Kate told him, when he came, that the baby was due in January, and Moses looked at them both with the calm, warm expression of a man who had been rooting for something for a long time and was glad to see it arriving. On the 12th of January, 1880, Kate Donnelly Underwood gave birth to a son. It was a hard labor and a long night, and the midwife from Caldwell, a competent woman named Mrs. Hartley, earned her fee entirely, and Vernon sat outside the bedroom door through all of it in the way of husbands then, which was to say helplessly, hearing and not being able to do anything, and he told Kate afterward that it was the longest night of his life, which was a fact and not a complaint. When Mrs. Hartley opened the door and said it was done and they were both well, Vernon came in and sat beside Kate on the bed and looked at his son, a red-faced, aggressively healthy-looking boy with dark hair already visible and lungs that had demonstrated themselves immediately and robustly. "What do we name him?" Kate asked. She was exhausted and bright-eyed and more beautiful than she had ever been, in the specific beauty of a person who has just done something enormous and is still inside the fullness of it. Vernon looked at his son for a long moment, then he looked at Kate. "Thomas," he said, "if you'll let me." Kate looked at him. She felt something move through her that was too large for her tired body to contain, something that was grief and gratitude and love all mixed together in a way that was not painful, but was instead the particular sweetness that only comes from things being recognized and honored. "Yes," she said, "Thomas Vernon Underwood." He held his son for the first time with the particular careful intensity of a large man holding something very small, and the boy opened his eyes briefly and looked up at his father with the unfocused, ancient gaze of the newborn, and Vernon said, very quietly, "Hello, Thomas. We've been waiting for you." In the years that followed, the Underwood farm grew in the way of good things that are tended properly. The cattle herd on the Northland expanded steadily, and Vernon's reputation as a fair and careful rancher grew with it, the kind of reputation that attracts good business partners and good neighbors. Kate's farming operation continued to be the most productive in the Cimarron section, and she added beekeeping in the summer of 1881 because she had read about it and wanted to try it. and by 1882, she was selling honey at the Caldwell market and had strong opinions about it. The way she had strong opinions about everything she put real effort into. Thomas Vernon Underwood was a bright, energetic boy who showed an early aptitude for animals that pleased his father, and a fierce stubbornness that his father recognized, and his mother felt she could not reasonably object to. He was followed in the spring of 1882 by a sister, Margaret Kate Underwood, who was born in a considerably faster labor than her brother, and announced herself to the world with the same vigor. Kate looked at her daughter for the first time and thought of all the women who had come before her, who had planted things in hard ground and held onto what they had earned and refused to be moved, and she felt the long line of them behind her like a current in the air. Arthur Price came to see the baby in his characteristically understated way, bringing a small carved wooden rattle that had been his own daughter's and was now appropriately aged for an heirloom. He looked at Margaret and at Thomas and at Kate and Vernon, and he said, with more feeling than he usually permitted himself, Thomas Donnelly would be very proud. Kate held his hand for a moment. "I know," she said. Gerald Forsyth did not come back to Kate's property again, nor did any representative of the Southwestern Kansas Land and Railroad Development Company. The railroad spur eventually ran a different route, 10 miles to the west, and the company turned its attention to other sections and other properties, and the Cimarron section remained what it had been, good farming and ranching land in the hands of the people who had worked it. Moses Grier visited in the fall of each year, regular as the harvest, and watched Thomas and Margaret grow from infants to toddlers to children who ran to the sound of his horse on the drive and climbed on his boots while he tried to walk. He surveyed additional pieces of the Underwood North land as they expanded the operation, and never charged them more than his standard fee, which they always paid on time. Hector Blas came through once a year on the cattle drive circuit and always stopped for a meal, and his guitar came with him, and on those evenings there was music on the porch, and the children danced with the unself-conscious joy of children who have grown up with music in the house, and consider it a natural feature of the world. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, September 1884, Kate and Vernon sat on the porch together after the children were in bed, in the same easy companionship they had always had, deepened now by 5 years of shared life into something that was both more comfortable and more profound. The Kansas evening was warm and the stars were doing their particular best, and the east field was dark and quiet beyond the fence line. Vernon reached over and took her hand, the way he had on the porch steps that evening. She had told him she was frightened of how quickly things had arrived, and she laced her fingers through his with the naturalness of long habit. "Are you happy?" he asked her. Kate considered the question with the seriousness she brought to real questions. She thought about the East Field and the deed amendment stamped and recorded. She thought about Moses Grier's face when Thomas was born. She thought about Thomas running to the barn in the morning and Margaret's laugh, which was so specifically her own that hearing it always felt like a gift. She thought about this man beside her, who had pulled his horse up on the Cimarron Road and recognized something before he had even met her, and had come back and had stayed. "Yes," she said, profoundly and specifically yes. He brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, not gallantly but genuinely, and she felt the warmth of it run up her arm. "I've been thinking," he said, with the tone he used when he had been thinking about something for a while and had decided the moment was right to say it. "Tell me," she said. "The section of land between our north boundary and the creek bend north of that is going to come up for Homestead Act claim next spring. James Whitmore, who held the provisional certificate, has decided to go back to Indiana. I talked to him last week." He paused. "With that section, we'd have close to 300 acres contiguous." Kate looked at the stars. She thought about 300 acres of Kansas ground, about what it meant, about what it would require and what it would produce. About Thomas and Margaret growing up on it, and perhaps other children after them and perhaps their children after that. "File for it in March," she said. He smiled. She felt it rather than saw it in the slight movement of his hand in hers, in the particular quality of the silence. "There's something else," he said. "Go on." "I got a letter from Ellen," he said. "My father's cousin, the one who lost her land in the Flint Hills." Kate waited. "She's been living with her daughter in Topeka for 2 years. Her daughter's moving east. Ellen doesn't want to go back east." He paused. "The claim north of the creek section is also coming available. 60 acres, good land." Kate looked at him. She understood what he was saying. "Bring her here," she said. He looked at her with the expression that had not changed in 5 years, the open, warm, direct look that was specifically his and specifically for her. "I haven't said anything to her yet. I wanted to ask you first." "Bring her here," Kate said again. "There's more than enough land. There's more than enough of everything." He brought Ellen Underwood to the Cimarron section in the early spring of 1885. A woman in her 50s with white-streaked hair and strong hands and eyes that had seen a great deal and had not gone defeated by any of it. She claimed the 60 acres north of the creek and filed the Homestead Act paperwork at the Caldwell Land Office. And Kate went with her to stand in the Territorial Land Office and make sure the clerk understood that the filing was correct and the claim was sound, because she was a woman who understood what it meant to stand in a land office trying to hold onto what was yours, and she would not leave Ellen to do it alone. Ellen Underwood looked at Kate when they came out of the land office with the filed certificate in her hand, and she said, "Vernon told me what you did, what you fought for, and how you fought for it." "I did what anyone would do," Kate said. "No," Ellen said, with the directness of a woman who had seen the evidence to the contrary. "You did what you needed to do, and then you let him help you, and then you made something out of all of it. That's not what anyone would do. That's what you did." They stood in the spring sunshine on the Caldwell Street, 2 women who understood the specific value of ground and claim and the right to stay where you had planted yourself. Kate held out her hand and Ellen took it, and they shook hands the way equals do, with firmness and recognition. Ellen Underwood proved to be a remarkable neighbor. Her 60 acres began producing within 2 seasons, and her kitchen garden was the best that Kate had ever seen outside of her own, and she had opinions about winter wheat varieties that aligned almost exactly with Kate's, which made their conversations both agreeable and somewhat competitive in the best possible way. Thomas adored her with the uncomplicated devotion of a child who recognizes a grown-up who takes him seriously, and Margaret followed Ellen around the kitchen garden with the focused attention of a girl who was learning something she intended to keep. In the summer of 1885, Thomas Underwood, who was 5.5 years old and had inherited his father's certainty and his mother's directness in a combination that was already formidable, marched up to Moses Greer during one of his fall visits and said, "Mr. Greer, I want to know how the survey instruments work." Moses looked at him with the measuring, serious expression he gave to all questions he considered real questions. "That is a worthy thing to want to know," he said. "Sit down and I'll show you." And he did, with the same patient precision he brought to every piece of work he did. And Thomas sat across the kitchen table from him for 2 hours learning the principle of triangulation and the use of the transit level. And Kate stood in the doorway and watched with the quiet, enormous pleasure of a mother watching her child becoming himself. Vernon came to stand beside her in the doorway. He was carrying Margaret, who had fallen asleep against his shoulder with the complete bodily surrender of a small, tired child. He looked at Thomas and Moses at the table and then at Kate, and his expression was the full, real one. "Look at what we have," he said quietly. Kate leaned her head against his shoulder, the one that was not occupied by their daughter. "I know," she said. "I know exactly what we have." Outside the open kitchen door, the east field stretched out in the late afternoon light, dark and rich and deeply, irrevocably hers, and his, and the children's after them. 30 acres that had been fought for and held onto and proved to be exactly what she had always known it was, the best land she had ever seen. The Southwestern Kansas Land and Railroad Development Company, filed no further claims against any property in the Cimarron section. Their railroad spur ran to the west and turned into a modest commercial success that had nothing to do with Kate Donnelly's East Field. Forsyth himself, Arthur Price informed Kate in a letter in the fall of 1885, had left the company and taken a position with a real estate concern in St. Louis, which seemed to Kate to be an entirely appropriate outcome for a man whose usefulness depended on other people's uncertainty. Arthur Price retired from his law practice in the spring of 1886 and moved to live with his daughter in Abilene. And on the day he came to say goodbye, he sat in Kate's kitchen one last time and drank her coffee, and told her that she had been the most interesting case he had handled in 30 years of territorial law, which was the finest compliment she could imagine from a man like him. She sent him away with 2 jars of her best honey and a handshake that contained everything she could not say without either of them being embarrassed. The summer of 1886 brought the announcement that Kate was expecting again, their 3rd child. Vernon received this news with the same particular stillness and the same open, bright expression as he had the first and second times, and then he picked Kate up and turned her around, which she protested on grounds of dignity, and then laughed at, and the sound of her laughing filled the kitchen of the farmhouse that had once held only her solitary breath. In February of 1887, their second son arrived, a large, loud boy who immediately distinguished himself from his brother by the specific quality of his opinions, which were few but extremely firm. They named him James Arthur Underwood, the James for Hector Blas's partner who had stood up at their wedding, and the Arthur for the old judge who had stood up for Kate when she needed it. Ellen came over in the morning after the baby arrived and sat with Kate, while Vernon took Thomas and Margaret to the barn to see about the morning feeding, giving Kate an hour of the particular quiet that a woman needs in the first days after a birth. She held James Arthur with the ease of someone who had held many babies in a long life, and she looked at him with the warm expression that Kate had come to love in her. "He has your jaw," Ellen said, "good and firm." "Heaven help us all," Kate said, and they both laughed. Spring came to the Cimarron section in the way it always did, all at once and without apology, the green rising up from the dark Kansas soil in a tide that never got ordinary no matter how many years you had seen it. Kate stood at the edge of the East Field on a March morning, with James Arthur strapped against her front in the way she had carried all 3 of her children when they were small and new. And she looked out over the greening field, and felt the weight of it, and the beauty of it, and the rightness of it in a way that had not diminished over 9 years of standing in this same spot. She heard Vernon coming up behind her, his boots on the ground of the farm he knew as well as she did now, and she did not turn around because she did not need to. He came to stand beside her in the way he always came to stand beside her, close and easy, his shoulder touching hers. "The north field is ready to turn," he said. "Give it another week," she said. "The soil temperature isn't up yet." "I thought you'd say that," he said. "I already told Hector to wait a week." She smiled at the East Field. "You didn't need to ask me then." "I wanted to," he said simply. They stood in the March morning on the edge of the field that had been fought for and kept and built upon, the field that had been the reason and the beginning of everything, with their youngest child sleeping against Kate's chest, and their older children's voices coming from the direction of the barn, where Ellen had taken them to help with the morning work, and the Kansas sky above them was doing the particular thing it did on clear spring mornings. The way it went so blue and wide and deep that it looked like something you could fall into. Vernon put his arm around Kate's shoulders and she leaned into him, and they looked at the field together the way they had looked at it for years now, with the specific pleasure of 2 people who know the value of what they are looking at because they earned it. "I love this land," Kate said. "So do I," Vernon said, "almost as much as I love the woman standing on it." Kate tilted her head to look at him. He was smiling down at her with the full, real smile, the one that had never once grown ordinary to her in 9 years, and she thought of the porch steps and the fire by the cottonwood trees and the Wichita land office, and the morning she had first seen him sitting on her porch steps with his hat in his hands looking at her with that patient, unhurried expression, as though he had all the time in the world to wait and see what she would make of him. She had made the best thing she knew how to make of him: a partner, a husband, a father, a neighbor in the most complete sense of the word, the person whose land runs alongside yours and whose life runs alongside yours and who chooses every day, as you choose every day, to turn toward rather than away. "I love you," she said, because she still said it plainly and often because it was true, and because she had learned that true things should be said. "I love you," he said, the same way he always said it, with his whole attention, without qualification or moderation. James Arthur stirred against her chest and made the small, expressive sounds of a baby waking up and beginning to form opinions about the world, and Kate adjusted him and smiled down at his red, brand-new face, and Vernon leaned down and put his large hand gently against the baby's back, and they stood like that together on the edge of the east field, while the Kansas spring morning went on brightening around them. The east field put out its best yield in the summer of that year, the summer of 1887, the spring wheat rising gold in the July sun, and the clover thick along the edges, and the bees from Kate's hives working the far end of it in the hazy afternoon. She stood at the kitchen window washing the supper dishes one evening in August and watched the light go down over the field and thought of the woman she had been 9 years ago, pressing her palm to the doorframe and telling a man in a dust-colored suit that she would not be moved. She had not been moved. And in not being moved, she had become the thing she had always been trying to become, not just a woman holding her ground, but a woman building on it, generation by generation, season by season, the good dark earth receiving what she gave it and giving back more than she asked. Thomas came and stood beside her at the window. He was 7 now and nearly at her shoulder, and had his father's eyes and her jaw and the particular quality of paying close attention to the world that she recognized as the best of both of them. "Mama," he said, "is that our field?" "That's our field," she said. He looked at it for a moment with the focused, serious look he brought to things that interested him. All of it," she said. "East to the creek and north to the fence line and every inch of the dark soil underneath it. All of it ours." He nodded with the satisfaction of a child who has received a complete and accurate answer. Then he went back to the table where his father was helping Margaret with her letters, and Kate heard Vernon's voice saying the alphabet with patient good humor, while Margaret argued about the order of certain letters, which was a thing she did. Kate dried her hands on her apron and turned back to the room, to the lamplight and the voices and the smell of good food and the sound of her family in her kitchen, and she felt the full weight of everything she had not lost, the specific, irreplaceable, hard-won richness of the life she had made and held onto and shared. She went and sat at the table beside Vernon, and he reached over without looking away from Margaret's letters and put his hand over hers on the table, and Kate looked around the table at the faces she loved best in the world, and she thought that this was what she had told Gerald Forsyth she was building, something that would outlast the lot of them. She had been right. The east field was still there in the morning. It would be there in 100 mornings after that. And the name on the deed was Underwood now, properly and for the record, which included both of them, which was how she had always meant it to be, 2 people on one piece of ground, unmoving.